A little over 10 years ago, around 2011, 2012, a mysterious illness swept through the small town of LeRoy, New York. About 7,000 people live there. You may know LeRoy as the former home of Jell-O. We all love Jell-O. Now, LeRoy is halfway between Buffalo and Rochester in upstate New York, or as many of you know it, not New York City. There's other New York. Anyway, a group of teenage girls came down with this mysterious illness that caused seizures, it caused fainting, it caused tics. Now, I'm going to pronounce it LeRoy, but many call it LeRoy, New York. But it seems that both pronunciations are acceptable, but even the local news, they can't get it straight. I've watched both. So I'm going to say LeRoy because it sounds more regal, and I'm going to give them that. I think I would have seizures too if I came from a place called Leroy. Have some self-respect. Anyway, LeRoy. Now, some of you may remember this story, but I'll do a quick rundown for those of you who are unfamiliar, who have never heard about it before. It started with this one girl, her name was Katie, who came down with convulsions and tics. This was in, I think, August of 2011. Then her friends started having similar symptoms. They were both on the cheer team. And then it spread, and even more people in LeRoy at the junior high school, it's a junior senior high school combined, started having these symptoms. It was mostly girls and one boy. Now, the school administration conducted tests on the building to see if there were any kind of contaminants, but they didn't find any. And doctors couldn't find anything wrong with the girls either. This is a town of 7,000. So everybody had an opinion. Was it the HPV vaccine? Was a cafeteria worker poisoning the food? Was it cell phones or chemtrails or synthetic marijuana? Now, there's a BBC documentary linked at the bottom, and this guy says he knows a nurse in the town who swears that the girls came in after taking spice just a few months before. Now, we laugh at rumors, but rumors really do serve a purpose in social groups. People bond over gossip, and they also hold their other tribes people accountable. Plus, gossip is fun. And we'd all be talking shit if we lived in LeRoy in 2012 too. Talking is most of the internet, so none of us can really act like we're above gossip. It's 2023 and we can see our cell phone usage, so gossip is a thing. Now, eventually, the faculty at this place called the Dent Neurological Institute, it was nearby, suggested that the girls were suffering from a conversion disorder. Now, conversion disorder is an illness which is psychological in its cause, but it manifests itself in the physical. Stress is converted into physical symptoms, conversion disorder. But the symptoms are real, whatever the cause is. Remember, the symptoms are real. So we look at this statistic on seizures, and it says that 20 to 40% are caused by conversion disorders. Now, what's unique about LeRoy specifically is it was happening in groups. So the situation was a conversion disorder plus a mass psychogenic illness, which formerly known as mass hysteria. They don't use that name anymore, but it's mass hysteria. So the two of them combined created this problem. Now, when the diagnosis was introduced in January of 2012, about half the patients and their parents accepted it, but the other half did not. They didn't think that their daughters were faking it. Remember, they're not faking it. The symptoms are real anyway. So they went to the media, and the story became national news for a few days. It was everywhere. What's happening in LeRoy, New York? What's happening with these girls? Now, we know they're not faking the symptoms. This is what's so amazing. These symptoms are real even though it has a psychological cause. Something deep in the psyche is causing real symptoms in the body. Also, what may have happened in LeRoy is the initial diagnosis of Katie was authentic and that others caught it through some psychic fashion. We discussed this. Go back and watch that video of the contagious Tourette's. I'll link that at the bottom as well. Tourette's was contagious in Germany. It's really scary that a lot of these kind of illnesses can be spread through word of mouth. Pontypool. Remember Pontypool, that movie Pontypool? That's what that was. It was a zombie movie. And I was like, at the time. But now I'm like, hey, all right. But they went to the media, and going public caused the disease to spread even further. 20 more people came down with it, including a 36-year-old woman who did not attend the high school. People in the town, they got really, really scared. Were the authorities trying to whitewash something? That's a legitimate fear that they had. Was this conversion disorder diagnosis, is this a cover-up for some kind of toxin that's in the soil of LeRoy or in the water of LeRoy, and these Jello bigwigs are trying to hide it? They didn't know. Erin Brockovich, remember her from the movie, and her team arrived in LeRoy to do a full investigation. Of course, she comes with paparazzi because she had a movie named after her and she's famous. They said they were going to get to the bottom of it, and they found some really disturbing things, truly disturbing things. In 1970, a train derailed nearby, and it spilled cyanide and TCE. TCE is an industrial solvent. That spilled into the soil. Now, cleanup crews were able to get the cyanide because it was in crystal forms, so they were able to sweep it up. But the TCE, it seeped into the water supply. So people started thinking, were these symptoms a result of that toxin? Now, it's important to note that Erin Brockovich and her team suspected that the industrialists were poisoning the water. And the reason that they suspected this is because very often industrialists poison the water. These accusations didn't come out of nowhere. And this is what they do sometimes, unfortunately. And the people of the town were furious, especially the parents. Why would they hide this? Are the children safe? Now, these parents really tore the school administrators a new one. They were like, why did you cover this up? And then, on the flip side, people didn't want to visit LeRoy anymore. Home sales fell through. Home basketball games were canceled because other teams, they didn't want to send their kids to this town. They didn't want them to be exposed. People didn't go to the LeRoy area for date night anymore, for activities. And all of these people kind of had a similar mentality. It's like, why would I put myself at risk? If it's in the water supply, it's everywhere. So of course, more tests were ordered, and they really tried to track down the source. Now, finally, a doctor by the name of Rosario Trifoletti, he's a pediatric neurologist. He's a pediatric neurologist, and he's from New Jersey, which is nearby. He came and he offered a diagnosis. He theorized that the girls were suffering from a disease called pandas, which can happen as kind of a side effect, a terrible side effect of strep throat, which is common. Now, PANDAS stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Streptococcus. But just think pandas. It's very complicated. The doctors obviously wanted you to think pandas because they could have chosen many acronyms for that. A lot of different ways that acronym can go. But just think pandas. They purposely made it cute. So basically, the immune system changes after strep throat infection, and it causes all these kind of different symptoms. And Trifoletti tested these girls, and they all tested positive for having had strep infections in the past or some sort of infection associated with pneumonia. Now, he offered the girls medication, and they got better. So great, we found the cause. End of the video. But no, because the panda's disease, like the panda bears, are rare, and they're so rare that new cases are newsworthy. And how can it affect a cluster like this? Just a note on clusters, just for the nerds in the audience, this is just in general. Sometimes clusters are meaningful, and sometimes they happen by random chance. Think about the old dime flick scenario, and we could have 100 people flick a dime onto a table from different directions, 100 different angles, and we'll see that the dimes cluster in certain parts on the table. It should be random, and it is random. But sometimes random doesn't look random, and that's why some of these random number generators, that's a mouthful, they actually have to randomize the numbers to make numbers look more random. Basically, clusters are natural as well. Is that what happened in LeRoy? Probably not. Why not? Because only the young girls came down with this. Caitlin Flanagan, you may recognize her. She said it in a New York Times opinion piece, and she said, it affected the cheerleaders, not the linebackers. There was one male affected, and these kind of numbers seem to run across mass hysteria incidents. It's mostly girls and sometimes the odd male. Hysteria is like getting caught up in a whirlwind of emotions and popular opinion. This happens particularly to people who are loosely attached to reality. Definitely go back and watch that video I recently did on mind viruses. We see how many of our brothers and sisters are actually susceptible to mind viruses, and we are too. But this is 2012, before social media really kicked off the way it does now. LeRoy is more of a traditional incident of mass hysteria than what we've recently had the pleasure of seeing through social media. Aren't we lucky? And yes, girls are more susceptible to hysteria than boys. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of theories. Is it the way that girls form social groups? Is it because girls are more empathetic? Is it because girls are better able to control their bodies with their minds? Now, in LeRoy, the victims of this hysteria, or perpetrators, whatever you want to call it, they were white women. And there used to be this idea that hysteria was a white woman's disease. But that's just because society was so self-focused. They figured, all we know is white people, so it must only happen with white people, right? No. What? You got to question your parameters sometimes. You got to look back and think about this. This is an anthropology question. Hysteria in young women transcends race and culture. We see it in Nepal. We see it in Ethiopia. We see it in Malaysia. I wish this were a video on hysteria, but no, I just need to let you know that about hysteria so you can get some background on the LeRoy incident. And it's funny because it's funny to me because people online are like, well, if we just left the broken West, we could be happy. But it's like, no, the whole of the human race is like this. There are no safe spaces. You're stuck with us. You're stuck with young women. Deal with it. We on Maya Muses, we love to crush people's idea of utopia. But seriously, hysteria is fascinating because it can actually be a very useful personality trait if used properly. Actors and actresses. These are hysterical type personalities, and they can channel that into incredible performances. We just shouldn't dismiss hysteria as an absolute evil among young girls. It just happens to be very destructive when left unchecked. Visit that Salem video if you have any doubts. We'll go into mass hysteria amongst young women in particular on my Patreon this week. The link to that is at the bottom as well. For my regular viewers, I'm launching a Patreon. Isn't that awesome? This is how I tell you. But I just don't think it's responsible for me to put out a video which can easily be construed as attacking young women, especially in the current online environment. But it's important to address it. It's very important to address it. I just don't want it to be misconstrued by people. I just think that the video would be easy pickings for the manosphere fringe, and I don't want to do that. So it's on my Patreon. Click the link in the bottom and you can check that out. I'm not ever going to make a video and put it on my YouTube trashing young women. Just remember that. So we're back to LeRoy, or LeRoy as you may know it. The young women who Dr. Trifoletti treated with antibiotics improved. But then, didn't the young women that the Dent Institute treated improve as well? They got therapy, and the other group got antibiotics. But both groups improved. Now, the Pandas group took their improvement to mean that the therapy group was faking it. That for them it was a conversion disorder, but for the Pandas group, they were actually ill. What likely really happened was the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is if a person wants to get better and they're given a placebo, usually a sugar pill, their subconscious mind will actually make them better. And this doesn't work with all illnesses, but it can work with conversion disorders because the problem is there anyway. So the Pandas side started denigrating the conversion disorder side because the Pandas girls got better with antibiotics. They needed a real treatment. Okay, I'm just saying what matters 11 years later is that both groups got better. We just see how the group dynamics happened, that one side was able to further attack the other side based on what. And also, let's remember that some of the girls in LeRoy may have been legitimately ill. They may have had a legitimate tic disorder. In the documentary linked below, The Town That Caught Tourette's, this is by the BBC, we see a girl from the nearby town of Corinth. She had similar symptoms that Katie had, and she found Katie on social media. She didn't go to that school, and she's not in this cluster. However, that girl seems to have had these symptoms even when she was sedated. So the doctor sedated her, and she was still twitching. So this girl was having body spasms even when she was sedated. It fits the pattern of the original girls, but maybe she could have been like Katie, a patient zero, a typhoid Mary, the one who actually had the illness, and the other girls caught the mind virus, and they have had a conversion disorder. Regardless, Erin Brockovich's team found nothing in LeRoy. The girls either got better through therapy or with antibiotics through Trifoletti. It has generally been accepted It has generally been accepted that the culprit was mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria, combined with a conversion disorder. Looking back. And it seems as though people just went on with their lives. They were like, oh, this happened. Now I know what you're thinking. Were the residents able to sell their homes at market value? Or did this screw up their retirement plans? Important questions, important questions. If that's the first thing that came to your mind, though, it means you're kind of a grown-up. It seems superfluous to the story, but it really shows the ripple effects of mass hysteria. That they're so great that we all kind of have a responsibility to keep it in check. Business owners might think, oh, those girls at the high school, that's not really my problem. But then the dinner rush comes and there's no dinner rush. It's a dinner trickle, but the bank still wants their loan payment. So it's kind of everybody's problem. Now, I'm kidding, of course. I'm half kidding. But fear took precedence over the day-to-day lives of this town. The parents became hysterical. They accused school officials of orchestrating a cover-up. This is actually similar to Salem, where the afflicted girls had symptoms, but much of the town got caught up in this whirlwind of fear and suspicion. Check out the Crucible video and watch that movie. It's the best movie. Fear, as we know, it just pushes rationality out of the window. Now, some townspeople said that they had suspected that the girls were having problems at home, but they didn't want to make it public because they didn't want to embarrass the girls. If this is the case, it shows how kind and protective the town was of these girls, because they were willing to take a material loss just to protect the reputation of these young women, and that's commendable. Now, of course, at the time, it would have been a very bold stance to come out and say, you are lying, you come from a messed up home, whatever accusations they would have made. And a lot of people don't want to put themselves in the spotlight like that, especially when the national cameras are watching. So afterward, they say, we stayed silent to protect the girls, but in reality, they just didn't want to put themselves out there like that. These girls, they said they had these perfect lives. There's nothing wrong. But then when people looked further, they realized they came from single-parent homes. Their parents were undergoing medical procedures, and this caused them a lot of stress. And that stress manifested in a tic disorder, and other people with unprocessed stress actually caught this disorder when they were exposed to the idea. And this is why it is so very important to be honest with yourself about your true feelings and what stress is doing to you, and know your limits. You got to know your shadow. Also, of course, these girls are getting attention for their illnesses. They went on Dr. Drew, they went on the Today Show. Now, some were no doubt suffering from real symptoms, as a conversion disorder is. But how many were doing it for attention? How many were doing it out of a sense of boredom? We may never know the true numbers for real, what the real ratio is. But no one's going to admit that they were doing it for attention anyway. Of course, we are very happy for them that they've been able to move on with their lives. But there have been some awkward trips to the grocery store since, when people just whisper, pss, 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 that's the girl who said she had a tic disorder. Pss, 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 she was lying, I know. Pss, 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 pss. There we go. That's gossip. Gossip, my old friend. Keeps you honest. Keeps you honest. Anyway, thanks for watching, and subscribe, and check down below for the Patreon video about specifically mass hysteria in young women, which is